Good morning, everybody. I'm Evan Medeiros, the Penner Family Chair in Asian Studies at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. It's my pleasure to begin today's webinar, which has been titled BRI in Crisis, ? The Future of the Belt and Road Initiative. We're very lucky to have three wonderful scholars today, all of who have done extensive work on the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. And we're especially happy to be doing this right at the end. Just today, this afternoon in Beijing, the big BRI summit that the Chinese have been hosting just ended. So, of course, October of 2023 marks the 10 years of Xi Jinping's very ambitious Belt and Road Initiative, arguably Beijing's most significant development and foreign policy initiative under the first 10 years of Xi Jinping. While the BRI has certainly become a hallmark of China's foreign relations and Xi Jinping's diplomacy, the aftermath of COVID and other domestic challenges in China have raised serious questions about what the future holds for BRI. Right now, this month, representatives from around the world, including several leaders, are attending the third Belt and Road Forum, the first one in 4 years. And again, it just ended today in Beijing. And we've invited three wonderful experts, Matthew Erry, Shui Gong, and Min Ye, to sort of discuss what did we learn from the latest summit, but more than that, we're going to dig deeper than that, what that means for the Belt and Road going forward. Today's webinar was co-sponsored by the Wall School of Foreign Service, the Asian Studies program where I sit, and the Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue and Global Issues. And I want to thank my colleagues in Asian Studies, Professor Yuki Tajima, the director, and Tom Bancroft, the director of the Initiative on U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues, for their strong support for all of these activities. Let's begin with an introduction to our wonderful speakers today. First, we have Matthew Erry, who's an associate professor. He's a member of the law faculty and an associate research fellow of the Socio-Legal Studies Center at the University of Oxford. So Matthew, thank you. We have Shui Gong, who has worked with us many times before at Georgetown. It's always a pleasure to have her part of our discussions. She's a non-resident scholar at Carnegie China as part of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and an assistant professor at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at NTU in Singapore. So if you ever go to Singapore, you've got to see Shui Gong. She knows exactly what's going on with China issues in Southeast Asia. And last but not least, it's always a pleasure to welcome back our Georgetown's good friend, Min Ye, who's a professor of international relations at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University in Boston. So Min Ye, Shui Gong, Matthew, thank you so much for joining us. And we're very excited to be doing this literally at the end of the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing. So it couldn't be more timely. I'd like to start with asking Shui Gong a few questions. Provide a little bit of context for us, Shui Gong, for the past 10 years. What has the BRI achieved? How have the projects evolved over time? Has it created the kind of connectivity that China and Xi Jinping initially set out? Basically, how do you think we should evaluate the BRI 10 years on?
Right. Thank you very much, Evan. It's my great pleasure to be part of this again. This is a very broad question, but I think many people would definitely look at the material side of achievements. So on the surface, definitely what the BRI has achieved is very impressive. From Southeast Asia to Latin America, the BRI boasts over 3,000 projects, like the railways, hydropower, highways, and power grid. And it also has set up, more than just those infrastructure projects, but also it comes along with those overseas cooperation that China wanted to exploit the Shenzhen model to those regions. And the next, people definitely like to talk about, the internationalization of RMB. And I think 2 years ago, the People's Bank of China, they released a report claiming that, the RMB reached about 5.42 trillion Chinese yuan growing by almost 20% along the BRI route. So all this to show that the BRI has really achieved something. But what, in my mind, what is more important is that the BRI can be conceived as a victory for China's foreign economic policy, especially during the first few years of its launch. There are over 150 countries and 30 international organizations signed on the initiative. Not only, those developing countries were happy to ride along with China, but also for, countries even like Japan who hasn't joined the BRI, but under Shinzo Abe administration, they actually seriously consider about the third-party market cooperation with China. So all these indicate that, indicate that, this certain level of victory that Beijing can claim for the past 10 years. In terms of, has it brought the connectivity wanted? Yes and no. I mean, based on the, those trade investments, I believe, there are more facilitations, more efficient, logistics. But when you talk about, when the Chinese leadership is talking about the achievements, right? They want to achieve something, I think more on the softer side, like heart-to-heart connectivity, 心连通, through building the 认同感, which means identification, acceptance, as well as the 共鸣感, which means resonance from the international society. So that is why for the past 10 years, we've seen China has been doubling down its investments, in public relations, in those propaganda campaigns, in, the societal level of connectivities, right? But in a word, to save time, if you look at the, the repercussions in terms of sustainable, sustainable impacts on some of the countries like in Southeast Asia, where in Myanmar, for instance, the local civil society, they were still very against the idea of building hydropower plants in their territory, right? And we've also heard about the debt trap narratives, circulating from some country and then started to gain currency in the region. And we've seen several BRI projects, they were either being canceled or they're being scaled down. So that basically, shows that people are serious about, the different dimensions of what the BRI has, brought to their country, and what are the consequences of relying on China, right? So in a word, I think in terms of this heart-to-heart connectivity, I feel China still has a long way to go, because if you look at the debates, especially from those development studies scholars, people start to talk about Beijing consensus, the China model, but nowadays people actually, the BRI give them another opportunity to zoom in, to look at the details, how China implemented those projects, right? People will definitely have a second thought in terms of whether, China could be an attractive alternative development partner, vis-a-vis the OECD, those traditional donors. So I don't know to what extent I cover what the question that you raised, but I will be happy to go back to the points when there are such questions. Yeah.
No, thank you, Shui Gong. That was excellent, and that gives us a good sense of how what BRI sought to do and what it achieved. How would you evaluate the results of the latest BRI summit, the one that just finished today?
Yeah, sure. So those, definitely we see lots of different new elements. I think that is basically a direct official response to the narratives about China, about negative impacts that BRI has brought. For instance, the debt trap, for instance, the corruption inducing, consequences of collaborating with China. So you've seen those new narratives about how China is going to institutionalize, the anti-corruption, activities along the route, and how they're gonna improve on the security risks of the Chinese projects, and how they're gonna collaborate with the host countries as well as like security companies to provide a much more, transparent and much more stabilized platform for all the investors to park their money in. Those, I think, definitely, I would definitely, see there's gonna be progress on the ground, but the puzzle actually in my mind is to what extent this BRI is being multilateralized. We've seen those institutions trying to be set up, for instance, by set up the like headquarters for the secretariat. But to what extent such secretariat can really adopt some stringent overseeing, that kind of measures to, let's say, to incentivize Chinese companies, or to pressurize Chinese companies to adapt the best standards. That's something that I'm really interested to know for the next 5 to 10 years.
So, Shuigong, is it your view that this third sort of global BRI summit was really about professionalizing the BRI, making sure that the projects are sustainable from a debt perspective, that they don't promote corruption? So do you think BRI is going to get sort of smaller and better, more professional? Sort of, is that what you think?
I definitely think that the Chinese leadership, all these technocrats, they want to promote that and want to, repackage as what the leadership, as what the leadership has been, calling for, like small and beautiful projects that can speak much local language, that can be more visible and can be more felt by the locals. So I feel this is not just for the professionalism, which they are supposed to do for the past 10 years. It is much more like, like a rebranding to me,
Interesting.
Yeah, the image.
And what's the new brand? So how should we understand the new brand? Small, you said small and beautiful. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah, that's not for me. That's actually from the leadership Xi Jinping. So what is new in this element is that definitely, the China is gonna concentrate again on something that is really good at, which is poverty reduction. And we actually have witnessed lots of progress in the Mekong region, where I think China has done a really fantastic job in terms of how they, strengthen the local procurement and support those local communities, and even talk to the local communities. So you've seen lots of progress on the ground, but such progress, they have not really been proliferated at the global level. So I think China wants to tap on this forum to show that they can do something, advanced, if not identical, with the OECD countries.
So geographically, where do you think BRI has had the most influence? I mean, it originally was started with a speech in Kazakhstan and a speech in Indonesia, so Central Asia and Southeast Asia. Do you believe that those continue to be the heart of the BRI, and this rebranding and rebooting will affect both those regions and perhaps others?
Well, China has been, bragging about the open, nature of the BRI. I don't think there's any like particular customized, BRI just for one particular region. It also depends on the receptiveness from those regions, right? It's like two ways of interactions. So if you look at this receptiveness, Southeast Asia, I think, they stand out as, as embracing the Chinese investments, not just during the BRI period, but also previously, right? And even within the Southeast Asian countries, you've seen the divisions, the discrepancies and different opinions about China, where the Mekong countries, I believe, they're gonna continue to be, the most welcoming countries. So I guess, to a certain extent, China may, China has already, China has already labeled Mekong region as the pilot area for the global development initiative, as well as global security initiative. So I think back to the question in terms of which are the easier case, then I may have to give the answer is that Mekong is the region that we really want to test what China is going to offer for the next 10 years.
Last question for you, Shuigong. How should we think about BRI compared to the Global Development Initiative?
It's a very great question. I've been begging this question for a long time. So GDI is definitely is very much, multilateralism anchor. If you look at the projects they are trying to do, and from those, I think about 20 around there, like the pioneering projects, many of them, they're under the United Nations, platform. And you've seen the investments, they're getting more and more, linear, right? In terms of the investments and the commitments, I think there are about 3 billion, if I'm not wrong. But for the BRI, I try to read very carefully between the lines of what the president has, conveyed to the international audience. I know they're gonna increase the investments for about 48 billion US dollars, and they're gonna increase those Silk Road Fund for about another like 10 billion US dollars. But what I didn't really see that they said it very clearly, the BRI is going to be more multilateralized. So it looks to me China is going to continue to sort of like, either still continue with the bilateralism or with the minilateralism, with perhaps, economies that can share the burdens and can share the same concerns and also share the similar likings of China, so they can do together. But I don't really see there are much international organizations that being really, promoted in the BRI as what it is in the GDI. So I think there is clear distinguishing, pattern for China to, sort of like having both of the initiatives together on board to achieve different things and to show, different demonstrative.
Would it be accurate, Shui Gong, to say that BRI is going to be a subset of GDI, and it's sort of the connectivity dimension or arm of GDI, whereas GDI is a broader conceptual framework? Is that the right way to think about it?
That's a good way to interpret it, but for now I don't really see it, because they are really different. They're convergence, but they're really different in terms of encouraging, actors, where I think China try to commercialize BRI. It's not something that they want to do as, foreign aids, foreign assistance. But for the GDI, it looks to me, it is more tiered towards like earmarked aids, parked in UN. So it may happen as what you said, but at this point, by looking at the narratives, by president's speech, I feel they are like parallel initiatives being explored by China to show which way, is going to be the better way.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, I want to invite Min-Ye into the conversation, because she's written a wonderful book and many great papers about the BRI. And Min-Ye, what would be most interesting for us today would be to understand how the BRI has evolved over time, because obviously its origins lay in both economics and geopolitics for China. It's been active in different regions in Asia, and then sort of seem to be going global. And of course, China's economy, China's politics, have seemed to have influenced BRI. Shui Gong said that she thinks China is trying to reboot or rebrand BRI. So I welcome agreement or disagreement, but walk us a little bit through the evolution of the BRI, ending your comments with sort of where you think we are today.
Well, thanks, Evan, for organizing this, and it's good to see Matthew and Gongxue. And I agree 100% with Xue's introduction of the BRI and the current state. Maybe I'll just start with my comments on the BRI and GDI. This conversation reminds me of the 1915 conversation between BRI and AIIB. And from China's domestic political perspective, BRI was so much more significant from China's perspective. And yet AIIB caught the fascination of Western or foreign observers. And I think maybe because the reason that I explained before. So on that, I think BRI matters more from China's domestic elite perspective, and I will explain today. And the other is I think you guys mentioned COVID-19, the pandemic. I think the 3 years of pandemic. So all the wins and debates, controversies surrounding BRI project in the last 10 years, the biggest challenge to BRI was COVID-19 pandemic, right? It's a connectivity project based on money and construction that involves a lot of people. And none of those would happen easily in any substantial amount during the COVID-19 pandemic. But I also realized the pandemic crisis, let's use the Chinese term crisis, right? It's Wei and Ji, it's crisis, but there's opportunity. So I do think the pandemic of 3 years helped China clarify what they are doing is significant and important and meaningful and will be pursued further, and what are the areas that they need to be fixing and mitigating and repackaging, I would think is a good word. Rebranding, I think China is, they don't think in that terms. It's more about repackaging, rethinking, re-networking. So I think so based on this background, that COVID occurred and interrupted the BRI process for about 3 years. So and to me that's great to see that we actually now have a new debate, right? So I just mentioned the repeat of the conversation surrounding BRI and AIIB in 2015. And in fact, within China, the conversation and debates on BRI was also repeated before the forum in China. I remember 2015, and from a global China's perspective, and I was very clear why China pursued BRI at that time. But as I was in China, so it was before the formal come out that BRI would be Xi's grand strategy, right? There was a very diverse, very, very interesting conversations and doubts, skepticism in China regarding BRI in 2015. And this time in the summer, I spent the summer in China, and I experienced a similar conversation, right? And so I think that the Chinese local governments or entrepreneurs largely lost a lot of interest in BRI, like they were unsure in 2015, but gained momentum in 2017, and this year before the forum, their mind was elsewhere, right? And general public who are not working on BRI, they heard the Chinese official rhetoric of how good it was to foreign countries, and yet they also recognized it was expensive, and they also read Western media's reporting on how it was criticized. So overall, the Chinese public perception of BRI before the forum was quite skeptical, and this was something that's wasteful of Chinese resources for something that it's not in Chinese interest. But leaving those noises aside, these noises are very loud, and noises aside, in Beijing, what I hear the most and people are most interested in asking me and in trying to get the answer to is how the outside world truly receives BRI. Was it so unpopular whether it's so good. I feel like there was enormous mistrust of our information that they receive. So so that was the biggest question. What exactly how outside world react to BRI, and to that I clarify that there are cross-regional differences and cross-country differences, and within country what are the divisions. And so my conversations with them are very, very appreciated. So I can see that they feel like they have a better information from a genuinely balanced outside perspective. And then the people who work on BRI are most I guess like most struggling to know is how to deal with a debt crisis, right? So BRI is make China subject to this massive multilateral pressure to shave its debt, and the people are also sharing their concerns of the intricacy, and then the general concern about risk to the Chinese personnel. So doing BRI overseas is not in the not safest place, and it's how to do that, right? And the China, along with China's increasing overseas engagement, assets, and personnel, the risk is quite real, right? So I report to you that what we cover of China, and China itself has a lot of diverse opinions and debates. So how they come out and decided on, yet this is something that they want to do, that says a significant volume of what's the underlying, what's the underlying logic of BRI among the Chinese current ruling elites thinking. So I think there are three, right? I always said that BRI is China's global platform that meets China's three yearnings on the globe. I say yearning is because there are significant interest in economic globalization led by China, and there is a strong interest in expanding China's political influence abroad, and there's also, lastly, I don't think we can discount this societal needs. The Chinese people wants to stay global, and they want to be able to build connections with other places, other culture, other communities. Okay? So if the Chinese as a educated class or ruling class, they have these three yearnings, BRI appears to be very critical to this overall pursuit. Now, looking at the writings or the syntheses from the policy communities, right? So my opening remark is kind of talking about those general undercurrents driving China's BRI thinking. But now, if we look at the published work, policy work by Chinese research scholarly communities and government affiliated communities, then I think they have done really good study of BRI projects and BRI policy as well. So when they look at, so I found three things. The first is they also did a very serious analysis of BRI overseas, right? Their scorecards has been generally positive, right, but uneven. And they are mindful that it's not a whole package success. Nothing can be a whole package success. So what do they use indicators? The indicators they use are still, the 5 bigger categories of 5 connectivities, policy coordination, infrastructure connectivity, trade, financing, people to people. Right? A very simple measurement that we see overseas, the Chinese development experts use much more comprehensive indicators. So for example, policy coordination, right? They use leaders' visits, bilateral agreements, and joint cooperation mechanism as indicator of policy coordination. And then policy coordination started with a very low level in 2013.
So Minya, can I ask you, so who runs BRI now? Right? What part of the system, if it's a tool of or if it is meant to be better coordinated, who runs it? Where does that exist in the party or the state?
Yeah, so I think that's a misplaced question. You know, so BRI, if it's what China does globally, it can't be like coordinated by one agency. So what the design in Beijing, they only have a liaison office that connect different actions. But then if you say, oh, where do they
for example,
the rules of the game, right? Then the banking rules, like if they do.
Well, what I mean is there an organization in the state council that reviews or approves BRI projects, right?
Well,
Wang Yi is the Politburo member with the foreign policy portfolio.
Yeah.
I mean,
so
does he have any say in BRI, especially the big projects?
Yeah, so well, I'll defer the institutional law question to Matthew very quickly, but I think it's a political messaging from the political perspective. So you do have a small leading group, right? A small leading group of the BRI, which is housed in the DRC, NDRC. Right. So if we look at the small leading groups, then we know they have oversight over how money is distributed and how they are accounted. And then the bigger backer, like how do you mobilize the system, do one thing, then it is the leadership's position. So I say the leadership before the forum, the leadership didn't give very strong signal how this would be going. So that's where we see all these conversations, debates, controversies, and the policy, genuine policy dialogues within the Chinese political system. Right? But I think for the reason that the BRI speaks to China's geoeconomic interests, like economic globalization interests, the political globalization interests, and as well as the Chinese at the personal societal level wants to stay global. And so I think those research based on that foundation could give a very clear policy direction to the leadership as well. And so BRI is still instrumental and an important platform.
So can I ask you this? So what would you say are the biggest differences between BRI originally in 2013, 2015 and BRI today?
Well, I think BRI from the underlying logic, it didn't change. You know, China wants to be a global force and becoming a more important. That logic didn't change, but what changed?
So is it a geopolitical logic or an economic logic? Because when BRI started, we heard it was about exporting excess capacity, and then other people said, no, that's too narrow. It's about building connectivity for geopolitical influence, and other people said, no, it's about society. The Chinese people want to connect with others all over the world.
Yeah, well, Evan, you know, can BRI do all those? And
I'm asking you. I'm
Yeah,
asking you.
that's what that's my observation, right? The Chinese is a cohesive or encompassing political economic system, and they will try to expand economic footprints globally, and the footprints could be the railways, big infrastructure, but can also be smaller ones and digital services ones. So I say the change is that initially it started with power plants, railways, ports, right, and those big infrastructure. Now it's moving. Economic footprints are moving more toward digital, toward e-commerce, toward the services, or still transportation will be important. And so if you have a railway, you need to build auxiliary transportation, but that's anticipated. I mean, you have a economic objective or political objective, and you do one act at one time and do another act another time. That's the way of they have to adjust to make it work. But the underlying logic of pursuing China's global presence, that stays. And in terms of what they then more, that will change.
Interesting, very interesting. So how would you answer the question that I asked Xue earlier about the relationship between GDI and BRI then? How do you see the relationship between the two?
Yeah, so I answered this question in 2015 with all the debates going on between BRI and AIIB. I said AIIB would be very important. It's a multilateral organization that China pursues. It's a global tool, but BRI was China's own national grand strategy, right? And I think that assessment is still most of my belief now in a bigger BRI encompasses the Chinese dominant political, economic, and strategic interests. GDI is a tool at the global platform. So I totally agree with Xue that the GDI will be embedded in a lot of this multilateral, and they will also complementary in practice, right? So if China does something in Argentina, for example, it could be both BRI project and in collaboration with GDI. So in practice, they complement it, like AIIB. AIIB contributes to BRI, but AIIB is not the big financer for BRI.
Got it. So I want to bring Matthew in here, but one final question for you, Min. What's the biggest, most important takeaway from the third BRI summit that just ended today in Beijing? What do you think is the most significant thing that happened?
Yeah, I think what to me, although it doesn't surprise me, so I have to say that, like, the content, the motivation and the future direction don't surprise me. But I think the most important is for China. As I said, there were lots of doubts within China and ambiguity within China. And now what the message to Beijing is clear, that a lot of countries still want to do BRI. They want China, after they build a railway, you should keep building other things, right? After you do the hard infrastructure, you need a more soft infrastructure, right? And so I think the message to China, and by consolidating the Chinese thinking, and that is most significant in the forum Beijing.
Interesting. Well, I want to invite Matthew into the conversation. Matthew, we've talked a lot about what BRI is and how Chinese debate and discuss it. We'd love to get your view on how the rest of the world is looking at BRI and the impacts that you think BRI have had in Asia and beyond. And you've obviously done some great work on this. So how do you think we should be looking at sort of BRI from outside in?
Well, first, thanks so much for having me, Evan, and really a pleasure and privilege to be part of this panel with such distinguished speakers. So my overall view is that the reports of the death of the BRI are greatly premature. It's interesting, in 2013, 14, there was a sort of orgy of excitement about the BRI, right? Everybody from the economists to art historians were very excited about the rebirth of the Silk Road. 8, 9 years later, everybody is sort of, claiming it's the end. China's economic situation is negative, and the BRI is a done deal. My sense is that China is learning, and this is something that we are trying to track in our project here at Oxford called China Law and Development. The last 5 years, we've been trying to assess.
Sorry, what's it called? China Long Development? Matthew?
China Law and Development.
Oh, Law and Development. Got it.
And the goal of the project is to try to assess how China is engaging with questions of international law, and also how it's engaging with challenging legal and regulatory regimes in host states, primarily low-income, middle-income countries. And we have this idea of the learning curve. This is the idea that Chinese parties, whether it's private companies, SOEs, lawyers, arbitrators, officials, but also their counterparties in host states, they're learning to engage with each other, right? So on the Chinese side, they are learning about how to engage with local courts, or how to operate within legal systems that are very different from their own. On the host state side, they're learning about issues of corporate governance in Chinese firms, right? And investment concerns following increased Chinese investment in their jurisdiction. So I think this process is unfolding, and I think where we are right now is sort of midstream. And certainly I totally agree with the other speakers. There's been a process of evolution, both on the Chinese side and the host state side. And also I think that, what we see now is a fine tuning or a refinement overall, right, of the BRI. So from the perspective of host states, so what has been the impact, particularly on the side of sort of, normative questions of law and regulation. And here I would say, first and foremost, that I find the conversation in DC is very much sort of focused on this idea that, the BRI is in collapse or in crisis. I don't see that in many other states. So we've been engaging with counterparts in a number of recipient states in Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Africa, Latin America. I think there's still quite a bit of appetite for what China has to offer, right? The public goods. And as Min said, absolutely, there's a spectrum of opinions on this. It depends on who you're talking to. Is it political elites? Is it the lawyers who are advising on these deals? Is it the business community? Is it civil society or the laborers, right? Very different views according to who you're engaging with. But overall, I'd say there's still oxygen in that room. And I'd say that, generally, there have been somewhat significant impacts, although I don't want to overstate that. So as a kind of general statement, there's lots of discussion about the China model. I'm still confused as to what the China model is, right? We have this analogous term, the Beijing Consensus, which is essentially, it's an Anglophone invention, right? The Chinese didn't come up with that term. But we do now have 中国式现代化, right? Chinese style modernization. Again, this very sort of amorphous idea. And part of the brilliance, I think, of the early BRI concept was its amorphousness, right? And I think of the great sinologist Perry Link's idea of language games. The Chinese leadership is very good at building out a discursive frame that then everybody kind of backfills, right? Whether it's the companies or the service providers or consumers, they kind of take it where they want. And I think that's happening right now with the Chinese style modernization. Having said that, despite its amorphousness, I think there's a number of points we could focus on. So the first is industrial policy. I think China's state-led approach, that is SOEs and subsidies, has some traction in certain types of host states, recipient countries, in terms of thinking about the success of China's economic development. I think an export-driven economy with a particular emphasis on special economic zones and manufacturing centers also has gained traction in a number of countries. And then the third thing I think is probably the one that has the most sort of traction going forward, which is issues of data governance. So I see data localization gaining traction, the idea that a data protection regime should really protect consumers against the corporate sector, not necessarily against the state, the public sector, right? Which is something that is very regnant in the Chinese regime. Now that's spilling out into other jurisdictions. The idea of course, e-commerce platforms, safe cities, all of these are gaining quite a bit of attention in host states. And then also broader issues in data governance, including the role of private companies. So Alibaba being the classic example here. And China has undergone, again, with the idea of that learning curve, its own sort of seesawing back and forth in terms of how tightly to regulate these companies. Initially, Alibaba was born out of a context of very light regulation. And then we had a very kind of tight clampdown on the Chinese tech companies. And now China's really at the verge of developing AI regulation, right? Which many experts would say is going to assist the type of developments that we see overseas rather than inhibit. In terms of specific examples of laws and regulations and other policy issues where we see, some success or traction, I'd point to a number of areas. So for the first, excuse me, I'm losing my voice. I had a 2-hour lecture just before here. The first is China's engagement with international law. China is still building its own alternatives in terms of the AIIB, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, China International Commercial Court, the International Commercial Dispute Prevention and Settlement Organization, which is really kind of a mediation body, the China-Africa Joint Arbitration Center. So there's a number of sort of bodies, organizations, platforms that China is offering in contrast to the Bretton Woods institutions and established fora like the ICC and in Paris, for example. In addition, as other speakers have said, China is very keen to engage with existing multilateral fora, and we see that through UN bodies. We see that through the London Court of International Arbitration and other examples where Chinese parties are very involved in what's going on there. But I'd also say at the level of bilateral sort of borrowing or transfer or transplantation, you think about in political science, this idea of policy diffusion, the lawyers talk about legal transplants. There are specific examples. So we've traced, for example, the Vietnam 2018 cybersecurity law looks a lot like the Chinese version. Also, the Uzbek data protection law of 2019 looks very similar to the Chinese examples. In Cambodia, they actually have a constitutional provision, Article 49 of their constitution, which looks very similar to the PRC Constitution's Article 54, which prohibits certain actions by citizens that could be construed as against the interests of the state, right? So we can see this kind of diffusion happening. I don't think it occurs through a kind of homogenous sort of modeling or sort of an imposition, certainly not from the Chinese side. I think what's happening here is host states, in particular autocratic states, non-democratic states, they see in China a kind of toolkit. And they kind of take and pick what they like from China, and then they integrate it into their own systems, their legal systems, their regulatory systems, their policy systems, and it's for their own advantage. And it doesn't always mirror kind of Beijing's own wishes. And this is something I think that sometimes analysts miss is oftentimes they kind of take their borrowing in areas that Beijing itself wouldn't exactly prefer. So there's a number of examples where we see this happening. Sorry, Evan, go ahead.
No. That's absolutely fascinating. It's wonderful. Can you sort of connect some of those trends, very, very interesting legal and regulatory trends, a little bit more to BRI? Are you saying that BRI is a vehicle for this, might be a vehicle for this? Or are you saying that BRI has had sort of other impacts on the legal and regulatory frameworks of, countries, recipient countries?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I always think about the BRI as a kind of discursive framework that sort of exists, it's out there. And
tell our listeners, what does that mean, a discursive framework? That sounds like a very Oxford term, Matthew.
So basically, it's a set of ideas that are generated by language, right? And language is very powerful, particularly when it comes from a certain leader in a very important country. But it really exists at that linguistic level. The question is how it is operationalized and materialized in practice, right? And I think that process is very much a process. It's not a given. And so local actors, again, whether it's the leader of a host state or a local law firm, they can oftentimes take that discursive frame and use it in a way that potentially is beneficial to their own interests, not always mirroring what Beijing would intend. That's essentially what I mean by that. And so the BRI, absolutely, it's been an important platform for developing legal and judicial exchange. So China is hosting judges from all over the world, training them up on Chinese law. Also students.
But is that linked to BRI? I mean, of course, China has been doing that. It's definitely, it's an outgrowth of BRI.
It is. I mean, you're right. So totally, these things pre-existed. They predated BRI. They will probably post-date BRI, but BRI has given it a real sort of stimulus, right? A real kind of steroidal punch. And so there's a number of actors, whether it's the Supreme People's Court or the International Arbitration Commissions or Chinese law firms, that are all kind of adapting this language of the BRI and hosting events, trainings, conferences, et cetera, with their partners in foreign states. So one concrete thing, Evan, and then I'll stop, but one concrete thing is, China is very concerned about the enforcement of its judgments overseas. This is an ongoing issue. And so one thing they do is they invite judges from those foreign countries to China, and they hold these training events and these seminars. And the idea there is that they will develop these sort of connections that ultimately will encourage faith and confidence in the Chinese legal system overseas, right? So that a Chinese judgment would be enforceable in a foreign court of law, which could be beneficial to a Chinese company or a Chinese party. So these networks, even though they look very, again, sort of amorphous is the term that I think about, but they do have concrete and material impacts in terms of shaping legal arrangements and relationships.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'd like to invite Min and Xue to sort of comment on some of Matthew's, very interesting insights about the impacts in other countries. What do both of you see? First Xue and then Min, what do you see as the major impacts of BRI on other countries?
Well, maybe I will start first. So I cannot speak for other region, but in Southeast Asia, I think the impacts, the forefront line impacts is actually the BRI spirit. I think it's very much translated to.
Sorry, the BRI what?
The BRI spirit in terms of building
Spirit.
connectivity. Spirit, yeah. It's kind of like a Chinese word, but I do have the sense that the region is very comfortable to hear that language, because the region has been talking about connectivity. I mean, from ASEAN when
Sure.
It started to become the leader, like driver's seat in the region. They always wanted to strengthen and build up and strengthen such connectivity, because they, at that point, that the regional leaders, they have the belief that by fostering the economic interdependence, the region will witness more peace, more stability, right? So that's why, like, the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir, he was actually one of the pioneering leaders vision about this Pan-Asian railway. So it's not like China's original work, but the BRI, I agree with Matthew's comments on how they gave how such terminology, such narrative stimulate the region, in the sense that encourage them to do something that they were unable to, and it also gives them.
Xue, can I ask you, has there not been in Southeast Asia? Hasn't there been some resistance or pushback to BRI? I mean, Vietnam in particular hasn't really taken any BRI projects, has it?
I haven't touched on that, but since you brought this up, I think Vietnam is a very very tricky case. They are like, I mean, they set up, I mean, during my interviews like a few years back when BRI was just launched, the Vietnamese officials, they were very enthusiastic about this idea because nobody know what the BRI actually means, right? So they actually set up some like sort of like ad hoc China decks to understand and try to figure out the like the railway projects with China that connects with Guangxi province. But later on, they really interpret it as China's geostrategic plans. So such enthusiasm suddenly cool down. So you don't really see them publicly resist the China's BRI because anything can be branded as BRI, right? Like the Chinese are mining investments, they're still ongoing in Vietnam, and also those Chinese, like the EPO, that kind of like that kind of contracting services provided to Hanoi SkyTrain. So this is really up to the host country's interpretation and their ability to respond to China's wishful thinking, right? So other than Vietnam, which is a very particular case, we've also heard stories about the BRI in terms of the big narratives, the big debates in terms of to what extent we want to be dependent on China. We want to be careful of such huge dependence, reliance. We've already been running the trade deficit, most of us, to China, and do we still want to continue with that? And if BRI comes, whether such trade imbalance will exacerbate, and whether China will make a case in terms of applying the coercive measures on some of the issues like the South China Sea disputes. So you've heard such concerns and also the inspirations revolving around China. But again, Southeast Asia, I think, is a very particular region because it has been dealing with China for decades. With even at the coolest point during the Cold War, Southeast Asia knew what to do, right? By playing the art of balance of power, and that is what they're being doing now. So back to a question in terms of the BRI, I think I would summarize, in two words. One is they like it, but second is it's too spicy to take it all.
Interesting. Okay. Well, coming from Southeast Asia, spicy is spicy. So, Min, what's your view? How do you think much of the world has reacted? Shuaib provided us a very nice summary of Southeast Asia. What about Central Asia, South Asia, Middle East, other parts of the world? How would you characterize how the world has reacted to the BRI? And do you think it's going to change?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. And well, maybe a tag to our recently complete conference at BU. We have a Belt and Road at 10, and where we invited speakers precisely working on the recipient regions and to discuss their experiences and their reactions, as well as looking forward to the future. I think in short, the global South remains quite eager to have continued BRI, whether it's a big infrastructure, small infrastructure, or technology transfer, digital services, and knowledge transfer, those sorts. And then Evan asked a very good question. What does BRI do? I think this is something that that doesn't bother us who study China, because we always work in very ambiguous, or massive, like discursive environment, right? But I lived here for half of my life and taught in a social science department all these years. So I know it's extremely difficult for Western thinkers to have to how to treat BRI, right? And there's no right way or wrong way, but I will recommend work by a good scholar at MIT, Taylor Farwell, and his team. They really try to measure rigorously the BRI countries, and so the work he presented, it's a collaborative work by Taylor Farwell. Presented to our conference audience, that really give a very good assessments, like what do you gain if you sign on BRI? What do you gain from being?
And can you give us a quick summary? We'll have to invite Taylor and his team for a future one.
Yeah, so they
Do you
look
gain
at
anything?
They look at economic results, not political. So apparently construction is significantly increased. Investments also increased, but less. And they also do like time lag, like when do you get most of the action. So I don't want to put the word interpret Taylor's results, but again, very good research, and it's ongoing research that the colleagues at MIT is doing. So shout out to them. To me, again, I look at from China's the communities or international relations. I think they benefited significantly in terms of capacity, right? So that's why I agree with Matthew, right? It's a learning process. To them very clearly from the beginning to now and moving forward. It's a trial and error. Right. And what they realized was that the vague China model, and they actually recognized, openly published, that the Chinese model of economic development was rooted within China's unique political economic institutions. So they are bound to be not good lesson for overseas. So that's the 10 years interactions help them come up with guidelines, right? You have to do institutional matching more as you construct projects, and take a cultural localization from the beginning, and also do more systematic technology indigenization. It's not what China offers will have the immediate audience, as Zhegong talked about. Actually, it's how you can match indigenize China's technology. So I think the legalization, how you can insert Chinese experience in legalization at the global stage. And they also realize, again, it's through the trial era of the BRI that global governance, the development, multilateralism have a lot of attraction globally. And so I think that's where, like in terms of political power pursuit, those direction will rise. So I think, to me, the gain for China and the capacity of doing global projects, the capacity of power projection, I think it has increased.
So would you say, and here I've started to get a bunch of questions in, and so let's sort of transition to a little bit of Q&A, but we've got a really interesting question about whether or not China has moved toward the era in post-COVID of continuing to export capacity building, or to make capacity building central to the BRI enterprise. I think Min, you'd be a good person to answer that question. Is capacity building central to BRI going forward?
I think so. Yes, it is. Domestic capacity essential, but the capacity China has in excess is different from 2013. 2013, the overcapacity was in cement, steel, right? And other industrial materials. And now the last 3 years of COVID, China didn't build a lot outside, but it built a lot of connectivity projects within China. Right? So I think the capacity is still in trade. The Chinese industrial goods still needs international markets, and the capacity in construction. And let's forget about steel rail for the moment, because China actually built most of steel rail domestically rather than internationally. Right? But bridges, roads, factories, zones, and those are still, and solar. So green technology now in China is in overcapacity. And digital product, digital services now in China are overcapacity. So I think if we still follow my framework, domestic overcapacity will drive the direction of BRI.
Yeah.
It will still so, but the content has changed.
So you believe that even after the third BRI summit, their effort to rethink BRI, that exporting excess capacity will still be a central motivator for BRI?
Well, that's a very good question. So I'm I guess like a liberal global economic thinker. So I think it's like when a country has overcapacity in goods, services, technology, manufacturing that are sorely needed elsewhere, and they have the financial tools and have the connectivity to bring those excess services and goods from China abroad. To me, that's just another wave of economic globalization that previous generations benefited China immensely, and the whole East Asia miracle was based on that.
So Min, let me ask you about, let's take the industrial capacity for internal combustion engine, right? So basically cars that run on gasoline. Is China, obviously China is transitioning toward EVs. Are we going to see a massive export of, of internal combustion engine vehicle production to other parts of the world? Because China clearly doesn't want it anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I don't think so, because China's now the overcapacity is in electrical vehicle, right? And so the companies inside China have finished this energy transition. I think it finished more quickly than otherwise, precisely because globally the atmosphere for combustion engine is just not there anymore.
Right.
A very good example of preceding this car industry is the power plants, right? So China before BRI and along with the early period of BRI, they conducted the parallel development, exporting coal power plants, and while transitioning to clean power plants, right? And in the earlier period, and the global environment for coal power plants was more permissive, so that increases. And then so I think the global environment, global community have a lot to do to shape the process and results of BRI.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, we get a bunch of great questions here. We've got a question about what we should expect for BRI in Latin America. Anybody looked at BRI in Latin America?
Well, I don't want to hide it. Why don't after Matthew and Gongxue, and I can add my comments.
I don't know much about Latin America, but I think there's a common trend in terms of China's, I mean, it also taps on the question that Evan raised to Ming about what is new in the BI. I think one term definitely captured my mind is the emphasis on the governance, especially the sustainable governance, where we've heard about building the green BRI since 2019 at the second BRI forum, right? Latin America, if I'm not wrong, it hosts one of the largest Chinese mining sectors as well as hydropower, investments. I mean, also it comes with the coal-fired power plants. So this new BRI, I mean, not really new BRI, but the new elements added by the Chinese leadership in this forum, I think China will, overall, regardless which region, it will do a better job to control the risks related to the environment, related to climate change. Because this is one of the areas where Chinese BRI has been criticized a lot, especially by those, international NGOs like Greenpeace,
Sure.
And China will also need to take care of the, the security around those projects. I'm not trying to imply, China will enhance security presence in Latin America. I think it has. Yeah, I think it will be far.
So Xuan, let me know that you make a very important point. Clearly, I mean, I've only read a few press reports coming out of the BRI summit that just ended today, and they certainly stressed governance, both sustainable development and debt sustainability, and all these things. Matthew and Min, would you agree with that? Like, I mean, it certainly sounds good. It's China's saying the right thing. Are they going to be able and or willing to implement it? Matthew,
do you mind if I say a couple words on this? So
yeah, please.
I think it's all well and good to look at these statements that come out, and again, sort of the apologies for the academic ease, but the discourse. But I think one really has to look at what are the regulations doing, and what's the behavior of the actors involved, for example, the Chinese companies that are working on these projects. And so on that point, in regards to, this question about Latin America is also about environmental impact of the BRI, as Gongxue was saying, the Chinese have a very checkered record on that point. I recently wrote a piece with Zhang Jingjing, looking at what the regime for Chinese outbound investment is doing on the point of environmental impact. And what we found was we analyzed hundreds of normative documents from, MOFCOM and NDRC and Ministry of Ecology and Environment, et cetera. And the regime for addressing environmental impact, in particular doing environmental impact assessments, it's much weaker than the regime for FDI into China, which means that companies, for example, US companies that are doing work in China face much higher standards to clear the regulatory hurdles than do Chinese companies that are doing the opposite, investing out, for example, in Latin America. So until we see laws with stronger teeth, it's beyond soft law, it's beyond these sort of codes of conduct that we see these ministries coming out with in bureaus. Until we see that, I'm not convinced, right? So that's what I think that's where the rubber hits the road.
Matthew, do you think the Chinese sort of when they choose countries for BRI, do you think they look for countries with weak legal and regulatory frameworks that sort of allow them to do what they want to do, and or buy off elites in the process?
Well, that's an argument that some people have made. But then again, remember that historically, what was the biggest recipient of Chinese outbound investment? It was the US, which has the strongest regulatory environment in the world, right?
But that wasn't BRI investment. I mean, that was...
Yeah, it's not just the factor of the weakness of the regulatory regime. So I don't know that there's an intentional effort to target those countries that have weak regimes, but certainly what we've seen is that Chinese companies, they kind of go out and they conduct their projects, but oftentimes they get burned because even if there's a weak regulatory environment, there's still, interest stakeholders in these countries that are going to mobilize a nascent legal system to hold the Chinese companies to account. So what we've done is we've collected hundreds of court cases that demonstrate how Chinese companies are being sued in local courts all over the world. And it's very interesting because there's a whole spectrum of issues that you can see from these court cases. But it demonstrates that even in so-called weak legal systems, civil society, laborers, activists, et cetera, are trying to hold the Chinese companies to account. So this is very much kind of going back to that learning curve part. I think global governance is terrific. I think, China would love to be a major actor in this area. And I think there is sincere effort there. We talked about sustainable development. What we've looked at in our project is areas, for example, space law, IP standards, international law enforcement, oil and gas. These are all areas where I think, China really has vested interests, and, in these so-called frontier areas, or the Tianyan, the frontier, the next sort of areas of law, I think that's where we're going to see more Chinese involvement. So that's something to kind of focus on in the future.
Mm-hmm. Min, what do you think? This question of governance is China, you said China's not rebranding BRI, but they are sort of re-engineering it. And do you believe that re-engineering will allow them to play a more constructive role on these local governance questions?
So that's a very good question, and I have the answer, but I think it's not very satisfying, because I think it will be half glass half full, half empty kind of scenario. And so I agree with Matthew that all the efforts or rhetorics for joint construction, the joint is a bigger word, big buzzword from President Xi Jinping, and also high quality sustainable development, and from China's domestic industrial domestic economic structures point of view, I do see green development, green technology has much more capacity to go global than before. But all that being said, for people who like we study development, right? Once the projects are on the locality, in a location, then it's the stakeholders that matter for that project will decide the outcome. So again, even for all the intention for good governance, then if you look track the what's going on, it will be a mixed picture. But I do want to share two very systematic empirical research. One was by Professor Habibi of Brandeis, and the other was by my colleague Kevin Gallagher's GDP Center. Right, so they did 10 years of study of China's investment and construction contracts. It's just not true that the Chinese money goes to institutionally weak place. Rather, it's the more sustainable, more stable places gets most of the Chinese money and construction. I think that story is quite clear. But China is not doing stupid things. It's for its own good. Lastly, on Latin America, my colleague Jorge Hines really writes prolifically on Latin America's involvement in the BRI. I think what they found is this co-production model. That is because Latin America has this discourse for logistic states, and Latin America's priority to develop logistic i.e. infrastructure, and Latin America's grave imperative for green transition. And they find China to be the most willing and most capable partner, right? So it's not the Chinese solicitation that Latin America started so saliently in the BRI global map. Rather, Latin American themselves initiated the process and channeled the process.
Interesting. So, okay, so you are familiar with some work on Latin American. Remind us who produced that work. It sounds quite interesting.
Jorge Hines, he was ambassador from Chile to China, India, South Africa, and now is our professor of practice. And so this conference was co-organized by me and Jorge and Gwen Road, who did a lot of study on maritime Silk Road.
And his work says in Latin America, it's demand pull on China as opposed to a China supply push onto Latin America. Is that, am I understanding?
I think because Latin America is very far from China. Like as I said, BRI originate from Chinese thinking of globalization. So Latin America didn't appear very saliently in the original globalization imaginary in Beijing. But the Latin American state agents, and they saw the complementarity and they alerted in that way the possibility of Latin America as a far end of BRI, and I think since then, in particular, the geopolitical change. So I do see that the increasing intensity in China's investments, trade, and perhaps when financing becomes possible, and construction in Latin America.
Interesting. Okay. Well, we only have a few more minutes left, and it's actually getting to be quite late for Shui Gong in Singapore. So I want to make sure that we end on time. We've got a lot of different questions, but there's one question that I think is sort of nice and crisp. I'm going to ask it to each one of you. And we're going to begin with you, Shui. What should we expect from BRI over the next 5 years after this third summit that just ended today in Beijing? So what should we expect from BRI over the next 5 years? And as you think about how to answer, so what I'm getting at is what parts of the world might China privilege? What geographies? Are there types of sectors, right? Min talked about excess capacity in electric vehicles, maybe some green energy technologies, right? So sort of what sectors will benefit? And how do you think China is going to be conducting BRI in the next few years, right? We've heard a lot about them sort of recognizing some mistakes and trying to improve them. So I just would love to hear from each of you what you expect from BRI in the next 5 years, given the fact that we're in some either rebranding, rebooting. Min, what was the term that you used of how do you characterize what China's trying to do at the summit this year?
Well, I said re-engineering.
Re-engineering. Okay, re-engineering. So, but five years, and we'll just sort of end on that. So we'll go to you first, Shui, then Matthew, and then end with you, Min. Shui? You're muted.
Thanks for this great question. I think the leadership has already defined what's going to be happening, which is small and beautiful. That means China is gonna really like lower the risks of some of the projects which we covered previously, like the coal-fired power plants. And I believe China will speak, I believe those BI projects will be much low profile. So they'll try to minimize the hype, in terms of how, extravagant it is, and in terms of, what is the inner reality. And China is going to streamline, the operations and strengthen the overseeing of those projects. What I find more interesting is in the Mekong region is where I see there's increasing law enforcement and security, not necessarily really related to the BI, because it really depends on how, the implementers, they associate themselves with the BI projects. But we do see, there are several projects in the name of BRI by these Chinese private investors that actually caught the attention of China, and then eventually turned out to be, a mixture of legal and illegal businesses, and that eventually invited China's law enforcement operation in the region. And I do see that it's coming more and more. So everybody is arguing about China's security and political intention. I think Mekong region is definitely a very explicit story to show that how the economic, cooperation is extending to the security and law enforcement cooperation. So in terms of the sectors, well, in Southeast Asia, definitely you see, the tech is the driving force among all these other investment
So
sectors.
digital BRI, is that what you
Yeah.
mean, or digital Silk Road?
Yeah, in general, like tech related, whether it be, you know, digital, whether it be info, you know, whether it be biotech. You've seen the Chinese, they are really parking their money here. I mean, even the Wuxi, one of the biotech companies, Wuxi, tried to sort of like, you know, minimize the sanction and American, you know, economic pressure. So they try to set up such branch in Singapore. So I would foresee, you know, more and more such high-end investments are gonna be parked here, especially in this country where I'm situated. But in terms of those medium or low end, they are even not being part of BI, but they are, I mean, you know, they're already part of this Chinese investment outbounding, you know, activities. So I'm not really surprised. And the other thing is the EV, you know, those green related investments, which I think China has a lot of sayings as well as a lot of interests. And the region is I mean, they're very receptive to the Chinese tech in a sense. So in a word, I mean, to save the time for others, I think the tech aspects for the economic reasons, for political reasons, you know, will gonna be the major forces for China to diffuse in the region.
Okay, we have 4 minutes left, actually 3. So let's be brief. Matthew.
Thank you. So I'll be very brief. So I think if we look at what's coming out of this most recent forum, the two terms that I see are green development and digital economy. And I think those echo what other speakers have said, and I think those are going to grow in significance in the years to come. More broadly, I would say, you know, the Chinese approach to the BRI has been kind of infrastructure first, governance second. To date, that's how it's been run. I think that spectrum or that seesaw is tilting a little bit now towards governance issues. And so I think the Chinese are going to be more focused on these concerns. For example, dealing with legal and regulatory issues. Gong Xue was talking about some of these spillover effects in Southeast Asia, absolutely law enforcement. So, I mean, a lot of this is contingent on, you know, the global situation. So there's Ukraine, there's Palestine, Israel, there's Venezuela's oil crisis, you know, in every region where China is now trying to extend itself, it's facing massive, like significant risk. And I think in that case, the governance issues, in particular, risk mitigation is going to play a more important role. And this is oftentimes, you know, not so focused, such a focus in the analysis. Apologies, my lights go off for environmental reasons. But the legal component is actually gaining some traction. So many commentators missed that on October 13th in Hong Kong, there was the BRI International Forum, which was focused on legal issues. And the attendees there hammered out a model agreement for FTAs, free trade agreements, that will be used, at least theoretically, for BRI related relationships going forward. So the Chinese are trying to put forward these norms, and the question is whether or not their counterparties are going to bite, right? Are they going to accept them? And that's an ongoing question. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. Wonderful. So Min, 2 minutes, last words from you. We're so grateful to have you here today.
Well, thanks to Georgetown the Dialogue for organizing this occasion. It's great to see Matthew and Gongxue, and best luck to you guys. And I will highlight just 2 points also coming from the forum. One is it's clear digital and green will be the sectorial emphasis of China's BRI in the next 5 years. There will be digital services expo in China every year for the next 5 years. That's already being planned. And two, I think for all the needs that Matthew and Gongxue highlight, I think the Chinese are focusing on the people-to-people aspects more. They have seen that as a big achievement in the file connectivity as well. So this time they emphasize the sister cities and diffusion centers, scholarship program, and the study abroad program. So again, going back to my original remarks that the BRI is about China's their own capacity building and about how China can learn from this exchange and how in that process they influence others' perception of critical issues in the world and regarding China. Thank you.
Well, Min, yeah, thank you. Wonderful note to end on. So Min, Matthew, Xue, thank you so much for spending 90 minutes with us today. The timing was perfect. Your insights were deep and profound, and it's clear that all of you have spent a lot of time looking at this. So I just would like to thank you on behalf of Georgetown University, Asian Studies, the U.S.-China Global Dialogue for spending time with us today. This is not the last session that we will do on BRI or Chinese foreign policy more broadly. So we will very likely invite you back at some point. And just many thanks to you, many thanks to everybody that is listening in and watching in real time, those of you that are watching it on YouTube, and please continue to refer back to the U.S.-China Dialogue, the Asian Studies Department at Georgetown. We believe it's important to remain a center of excellence on research on China in the world. So thanks everybody and have a great day.